Chapter 2. Religious Heritage. Lloyd's father and mother had both come from religious backgrounds. His grandfather, Julius Henry Zoschke, was a Lutheran lay minister living in Hinterpommern, Germany, where Lloyd's father was born in 1857. He was the second son in the family of 5 children. Hinterpommern was originally a part of Poland. Henry's mother's name was Caroline. Her family was considered in the upper class, but because she fell in love with and married a poor lay preacher, she was ostracized by her family and cut off by the government from any support for her children's education. In 1870, the oldest son, August, migrated to America to avoid being drafted into the army. He finally settled down on a farm in North Dakota, and as his brothers Henry and Albert approached draft age, he sent them some money to come to America. It was not quite adequate, but the boys, who are now 17 and 15 respectively, were eager to go. Their parents also encouraged them. One night in the summer of 1874, under the cover of darkness, they bid their family adieu and left with their blessing. Their mother gave them some sandwiches and some hard cookies, which they stuffed in their pockets, and they set out for the coast. They journeyed partly by train or wagon, when some kind driver would transport them over the bumpy highways, but mostly they traveled by foot. They were headed for Amsterdam in Holland, where they knew they would be able to find passage to America. When they finally arrived there, after over a week's journey, tired, hungry, and with very little money, they decided to board one of the vessels lying in the harbor, which they were sure was sailing soon for New York City. The dock was so crowded and there was so much bustle and activity going on that it was not too difficult for them to board the ship without notice. They pretended to be longshoremen working along with the crew as they loaded the ship. In some manner they managed to hide themselves until the ship was well out to sea, and they knew they were safe from being returned to shore. Then they came out of hiding. It was a harrowing trip, with nearly 2 months on the water. The brothers worked a few weeks in New York until they had accumulated enough money to take them to North Dakota, where their brother August was anxiously awaiting them. Neither of the younger brothers was happy in North Dakota. In the meantime, their parents, Julius and Caroline Zoschke, with their 2 young daughters, Lena and Henrietta, had left Hinterpommern for America, with St. Joseph, Michigan, as their destination. They had several friends in that village who had migrated from their hometown in Germany and settled in St. Joseph. Julius Zoschke bought a farm in Benton Township, which was on the northeast corner of which is now Napier Avenue and M 139. So Henry and Albert came to Michigan from North Dakota to live with their parents. Henry worked for several years as a carpenter, and in March 1888 he married Minnie Glade, the daughter of Michael and Emily Glade of Townline Road, Benton Township. Michael, Lloyd's grandfather, was born on August 21st, 1816, in Morgenstern, Prussia. His surname was von Glade. This was in the midst of a score of peaceful years for Prussia. The states of Germany had been in great turmoil for many years prior to this time, and worse times were to follow. The rulers of Germany seemed to think that war was the cure for all her troubles. If we can but understand a little about the political upheaval in Europe at this time, it is easier for us to realize why so many young men of draft age migrated to the United States. While Napoleon was sweeping through the continent with his troops, he conquered Germany and ruled with an iron hand. All the land went to work ready for a fight when they could throw off the yoke of France, which was so hard to bear. Napoleon put to death all who dared to show their hatred of his harsh rule, and he made their young men serve him in his wars. But all the time they were secretly training for war which would set them free. All through the states of Germany there was this band of men sworn to free Germany from the yoke of France. Finally, all Germany except Saxony rose up against France. Austria joined the rest of Germany, and a great battle was fought in Leipzig in 1814. The German troops became so strong they could push into France, and later in 1814 they closed in on Paris. Finally, Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo in 1815 and banished to the lonely island of St. Helena, where he died, and the end came to all his dreams of fame. After Napoleon's death, the King of Prussia and the Emperors of Russia and Australia met to make the terms of peace, which lasted for more than 20 years. It was in such a world and at such a time that Michael von Glade was born in Prussia in 1816. In the 20 years of peace, the country developed all sorts of trades and grew in the arts, both fine arts and industrial. This was the day of Beethoven and Wagner, of Hoffmann and von Weber, all great musical geniuses, but all very poor German musicians who lived in attics and could barely subsist on their wages. This period also produced great writers. Literature flourished, and Munich, Germany, became the center for famous artists. This was the era of the Renaissance. After these years of peace, other rulers ruled with an iron hand, and all Germany again was plunged into war. Much blood was shed. Ferdinand, who was emperor, gave up his crown to Franz Joseph in 1848, and in time all the German states were united under his rule. It was in that year that Michael von Glade married Hannah Worski. In February 1854, Michael and Hannah embarked for America on a sailing vessel from the harbor of Hamburg for New York. They had no children. However, Hannah was pregnant at the time. The passage across the Atlantic took 72 days, most of them fraught with fear and danger. This was the season of icebergs and severe winter storms. After being at sea about 6 weeks, Hannah gave birth to a baby girl, whom they named for her mother. She was a beautiful baby and the pride of her parents. She was also the object of much attention from the passengers and motley crew who were crowded into the little ship. Finally, one day, when they were nearly across the Atlantic, a furious storm came up, tossing the little craft about in a merciless way. The winds lashed furiously at the masts and sails. The ship was caught as if by the hand of a giant. She could not head up into the wind or ride the mountainous waves, so the captain let her drive, after ordering the crew to haul down the sails. The sun did not shine by day or the stars appear at night, so it was entirely impossible to tell where the ship was heading. All the hope that any should be saved was abandoned. They were at the mercy of the sea. The main mast broke off, and the ship's galley was stripped off and carried out to sea. It was a fearful experience. Everyone thought all on board would perish. Each hung tenaciously to the rigging or to anything stationary they could cling to, but the captain of the ship managed to keep his craft upright, and with tremendous effort the crew bailed out the water continuously for 48 hours, which kept the ship from sinking. After the storm had subsided, Michael and Hannah knelt down before their bunk and offered a prayer of gratitude to Almighty God for sparing their lives. The storm had lasted 3 days. The sailing was still dangerous, but no lives had been lost, though the ship was badly damaged. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm abated, and the wind changed its course, blowing softly from the south. But the ship was many leagues off course, since she had been blown in a northerly direction while riding the tempestuous waves those 3 perilous days. No one had any sleep during this harrowing experience, except little 4-week-old Hannah von Glade. The following day the captain thought that he'd spied land, though he did not know where they were. He kept his battered craft on a northwesterly course, and struck anchor several miles from shore. The sea was now calm, and everyone on the little ship rested for the first time in nearly a week. In truth, they had reached the friendly shores of Canada, and were near the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. They sailed down the river to Quebec, where the weary travelers were glad to embark. They had spent 72 days on the ocean. This was now the spring of the year April 1854 to be exact. After spending some time looking around in Canada for a fit place to live, Michael von Glade decided that he did not want to settle there. So he took his little family and set out for Chicago with several other families. In the words of his daughter, Minnie, Lloyd's mother, who left a record of her father's experience, they saw Chicago was a mud hole with only a few log cabins. They did not like it there, so he and several other men came to St. Joseph, Michigan, to investigate, walking around the lake. They went back to Chicago and brought their families to St. Joseph. The men all worked in a sawmill. Soon after he arrived in St. Joseph, Michael von Glade changed his name to Glade. 2 years later, in the summer of 1856, the Michael Glade family were out riding one day in an old spring wagon. The wagon broke down, frightening the horse which was hitched to it, and the little 2-year-old Hannah was killed, and her mother severely injured. She was with child again, and her time was nearly up. A boy was born, but Hannah died. Miss Guard took the baby and cared for him, but the child, whom the father named Carl, lived only 8 days. This loss was almost more than Michael Glade could bear. After the 3 funerals were paid for, he did not have enough money to pay for his supper, lodging, and breakfast at Mrs. Guard's, so he pawned his watch with her. After he came back from work the next day, he paid her and received his watch. After working diligently for 6 months and saving his money, he wrote to a young man in Germany, 13 years his junior. Wait, did I say man? A young woman in Germany, 13 years his junior, asking her to come to America to marry him. Her name was Emily Louisa Charlotte Sturlow. She was born in Stettin near Strop, Germany, May 19, 1829. She came with an aunt and an uncle, the Theodore Vielers, and several other families from the same community. Michael and Emily were married on July 4th, 1857. Their first child, Minnie, Lloyd's mother, was born on the first day of May, 1858, in a house on the corner of Broad and Church Streets in St. Joseph, where the First Baptist Church now stands. Sometime later, the Glades bought 20 acres on Langy Avenue, St. Joseph, but it was not enough land for a farm, so they sold it and purchased 40 acres on Town Line Road in Benton Harbor Township from George Krull for $1,100. This was 1864. Michael moved his family, which consisted of 4 children, onto the farm in April, just in time for spring planting. There were now 3 little boys in the family besides Minnie, who was 6 years old. The boys were Emile, born January 15th, 1861, Ewald, born August 23rd, 1862, and Henry, born June 29th, 1863. All 3 and Minnie were born in St. Joseph. On moving day, Emily and the little boys rode in a lumber box wagon drawn by a team of oxen, while Minnie rode up on top of a big pile of stove wood, which had been loaded on to a 1-horse wagon driven by Mr. Krull. The little girl was so uncomfortable on her precariously high perch that she kept calling down to Mr. Krull every few minutes to know if they would be there soon. Those 6 miles from St. Joseph to their new home on Town Line Road seemed a long, long way to the little 6-year-old girl. Minnie spent the next 25 years on the farm with her parents. The family grew steadily, with 6 more children making their appearance from time to time, making 10 altogether. Louis was born on the new farm, being born the year following its purchase. His date of birth was February 16th, 1865. Another boy, whom his parents named August, came a little over a year later, on November 24th, 1866. Then after 2 more years, Emily presented her husband with twin girls, whom they named Anna and Emma, both on the 23rd of August, 1868. Emma died the next month on the 10th of September when she was only 18 days old. But Anna lived to a good old age, becoming the wife of John Hollister and living most of her life in Los Angeles, California. Another son, William, was born to Emily and Michael Glade on September 15, 1870, and 4 years later, Emily's last child was born. This baby, a girl they named Laura, appeared on December 17, 1874. She was not a very strong child and passed away at the age of 4 on the first day of April 1879. Ewald, who was 17, had died the previous winter on January 8, 1879. So in spite of the fact that the family was reduced by 3, there were still 7 growing children in the home of Michael and Emily Glade. The last 6 were all born at home in the big frame farmhouse on Town Line Road. Michael had chosen his property well, and each year the farm produced a good living for his family. Minnie, who was the oldest, virtually became the head of the household and learned to accept responsibility at an early age. She was only 10 years old when the twins were born, but she was a great help to her mother. Babies seemed to come easy in those days, and often Emily had her offspring without the help of a physician, so there was no one but Michael and Minnie to wait on her and to get the meals, which in itself was an endless job. Minnie's father and 5 brothers consumed mountains of food, it seemed. Usually the neighbor lady was present to help with the delivery of the baby, and she always stayed to bathe and dress the infant, but all the other little tasks seemed to fall on Minnie's young shoulders. As she grew older and more babies kept coming, Minnie's responsibilities and tasks inside the house kept mounting. She learned how to cook and sew and mend, and could knit any garment from sweaters to socks and mittens. Her knitting needles fairly flew when she did so. She pieced quilts and made afghans and comforters. She mended meticulously. Her brothers never minded wearing socks Minnie had mended or overalls and pants that she had patched. Her duties inside the house were so great that she never required to work on the farm. Besides, there were so many boys, Michael Glade had all the hands he needed to carry on his farm work and do the chores. Every Sunday, the family attended the German Baptist Church in St. Joseph. 2 teams were needed to transport the family. The Glades always kept at least 3 horses and had several cows to keep their big family supplied with fresh milk and cream. Butter was churned twice a week, and Mrs. Glade managed to make good old-fashioned cottage cheese at least once a week. In the winter there were hogs to butcher, followed by the curing of hams in the smokehouse, and the trying of lard in big kettles. It seemed as if they could never make enough lard to supply the shortening for the quantities of pies, bread, and biscuits which were consumed through the year. All the fruit for the pies was grown on their own farm, and by the time Minnie was 12 years old she could make as good pies as her mother. Her soda biscuits were always light and tender, eaten with maple syrup or honey from their own hives. They disappeared fast with so many hungry men to feed. Monday was always wash day. What a back-breaking job it was to get the big copper boiler filled with water, which was pumped by the pailful from the pump in the backyard, from which it had to be lugged into the kitchen. The boil was placed over a hot fire in the iron range, where the water was heated to a boiling point. All of the white clothes were boiled and then removed to a big galvanized wash tub sitting on a wooden bench beside another tub with a hand wringer between them. Here the clothes were scrubbed on a big washboard, with Emily using homemade soap. Then they were wrung through the wringer, which often was operated by one of the boys. After the clothes were swished around good in the rinse water, they were again wrung out and ready to be carried out into the backyard, where they were hung up to dry. Can you imagine the number of overalls, shirts, underwear, usually long and often red, besides the women's and little girls' dresses and petticoats, chemises, shirts, and panties, along with the tablecloth sheets, pillowcases, and towels, and long black stockings belonging to the girls, and the shorter heavy socks belonging to the men, that were washed and dried and ironed every week by Minnie and her mother? After the clothes were laundered and put away, the ones that needed mending were taken care of on every Thursday. Minnie acquired this habit from her mother, and after she had a home and a family of her own, she always continued this practice. When she was 28 years old, she met Henry Zoschke, who was still living with his parents on Napier Road. They attended the same church in St. Joseph. Minnie accepted Henry's offer in marriage, as she was ready and thoroughly capable of rearing a family of her own. Minnie and Henry were married in March 1888. Minnie and Henry Zoschke, as we have seen, lived for a time in Benton Harbor on Foster Street before buying their farm in Hagar Township. The 3 years were difficult ones, and Minnie now had all her work to do alone, in much the same fashion as when she was on her parents' farm, except for the fact that there were not so many to help her, and there were not as many conveniences to work with. But she had a good, strong constitution and a will to work. She made her children's clothes and knitted all their mittens and warm stockings and scarves. Her ability to sew and mend now came in handy. Besides her excellent domesticity, she took time to read. She surrounded herself with good literature. Her favorite book was the Bible, which she read avidly and with deep understanding. A day never passed without her reading it. Thus she brought her children up to love God's word and to pursue its teaching. The stories in the Old Testament came alive when she read or told them to her children, and the precepts of Jesus which she taught them were accepted as gospel, something to live by and give meaning to life. The laws of God were meant to be kept. In other words, God meant what he said, and woe to the person who did not obey his commandments. There were no two ways about it. He created families where parents were to be obeyed also, and no questions asked. Ma was a strict disciplinarian, but that was the way it should be. The Bible said, "Children, obey your parents," according to Paul, and when God gave Moses the 10 Commandments, the 5th one was the first one with a promise attached, and therefore it was to be strictly kept. She often repeated to her children, "Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee." Yes, Ma meant to bring up her children to know God, even though it was a fearful picture she painted sometimes. Her children were taught that it was impossible to serve God and mammon at the same time. God would have nothing to do with anyone who was serving the devil. Ma's religion was one of frightful consequences with those who strayed from the straight and narrow way. Her children were brought up to know that there was only one way to salvation, and that was by being cleansed by the blood of Jesus Christ, who was the Son of the living God. She told them that they must come to God with their whole heart and serve him unreservedly. You must surrender yourselves to your Redeemer and know positively that he has forgiven you, she told them. Then and then only will you be perfectly happy. Ma was right, but sometimes her religion was a little harsh, without too much emphasis on God's great love. But her children listened with great respect and reverence, and it paid off. All of them came to know God in a personal way, and Lloyd had a great desire to serve him. Lloyd's family continued to go to the German Baptist Church in St. Joseph as long as Pa lived. It was a long ride each Sunday from their farm in Hagar to the church in St. Joseph. They didn't seem to mind it in the summer, but in the winter, when the snow was deep, it was a real effort, especially if they went back at night. It was a big task, even to get the horses out and hitched to the bobsled. It took plenty of blankets and straw in the box of the sleigh to ensure warmth. It was a long drive, those 7 miles over rough roads. Sometimes those who were not driving would fall asleep on the way home. One Sunday night, when the family arrived home from church late in the evening, they found the house filled with smoke. They had apparently arrived just in time. A live coal had been ejected from the heating stove and landed on the carpet. It burned a hole in the floor, about 3 feet in diameter, and the carpet around it was a smoldering. No doubt, in seconds it would have burst into flames. As long as Pa lived, the family continued to attend church in St. Joseph, but after his death in May of 1915, they transferred their membership to the First Baptist Church in Benton Harbor. Paul had never learned to speak English well and was much happier in the German church. He had often heard his great-grandmother, Glade, talk about the religious... Sorry, this is a change to cursive, and so I can't read this very well. There's something which took place in Germany when she was a little girl. Her family were all Baptists whose beliefs were contrary to the state church. Consequently, in order to worship according to the dictates of their hearts, they were obligated to worship in secret. They would pack up some food and leave home after dark on Saturday night, traveling several miles on foot to the home of friends who lived on the edge of a forest where they would meet other Baptists on Sunday night for a service which would be read something under the cover of darkness. After the service was over, they moved they remained there a good time of the night. No, maybe traveled back home, arriving home slightly before dawn on Monday morning. Another story Lloyd remembered his grandmother telling him about was the time when people who died something belonging to the church state being Oh, so it sounds like their homes were searched for the Bible. And so his grandmother's mother hid the Bible by baking it in a loaf of bread where it was so well concealed that it was never found.